Hello and welcome to the Gemhawks YouTube channel. I hope you're having a beautiful day today. For the free wire tutorial today, I'd like to share with you my wide woven ring. This is a project that I came up with many years ago, 11 or 12 years ago, when I really first started playing with wire and teaching myself different weaves. It's a fantastic way to use up sections of woven wire where you've had a practice, you've tried a new weave, you've really gotten into your groove and you just think, well, what do I do with that now? Why don't we turn it into a ring? Let's take a closer look at the project and then I will demonstrate it to you. So this is the ring that we've made today. It's quite wide, it's 4 wires, all woven together in a particular kind of zigzag design. Now it's based loosely on a sumac weave, but it's just something that I tend to call a zigzag weave. So I'm going to show you first of all how to create this weave, and then if you wanted to explore a few more weaving ideas, I'll pop a little video link up for you that you can check out later on. So the wires that I'm working with are 1mm or 18 gauge wire. You can work with slightly heavier wire if you prefer, but in order for this to be as beginner friendly as possible, I'd really like to try that out with some 1mm or 18 gauge. I have 4 lengths in total of the heavier gauge wire, which is 1mm, and these are 6-inch lengths. That's because I have relatively slender fingers, unlike the rest of me, but you could of course totally size that up if you wanted to make a much larger ring. So the first thing I'm going to do is just give each of those wires a little bit of a warm through. As I've mentioned recently, you don't need to put a huge amount of tension or strength into the warming through of the wires. It's more about the heat of your hands. So just a couple of passes between thumb and forefinger will certainly help those to be very glossy and smooth. I'm working with raw copper as I normally do. Now I'm going to show you the beginning of the weave, and the next wire that you will need is 0.4mm or 26 gauge, and you will definitely need to work from the reel because dependent on how tightly packed your weave is, you may use a lot of wire or you may use slightly less. So I'm going to begin by bringing in a couple of those pieces, the 4 pieces of wire, and I'm just going to wrap very loosely a couple of inches from one end all the way around one of those heavier gauge pieces of wire. Now we will be undoing this later, so don't put too much tension or squishing into this section of wire just here. The reason I loop just loosely around that first wire I'm touching is because we will very much want to keep a distance between each of the wires as we add them, and if you don't add that little loop around our bottom as you're looking at it now wire, what can happen is the 2 wires come too close together and you then can't get the finer gauge wire between them. So we'll pull that finer gauge tail of wire up and away, and we'll add 1 more wire into position. I'm just going to slide that over. Now on these 6-inch lengths of wire, I'm going to be working about 1.5 inches from one end. I'll be aiming to leave around about 1.5 inches actually, so I'm just going to scooch that along until it's about 2 inches from one end. What we're going to do now is just gently lift up. If we've got the number 1, number 2 and number 3 wire, the first thing that we're going to do is to wrap around just the number 1 and number 2 wire. So let's make sure there's plenty of light on that. You can see that gold wire glinting nicely in the light like so. And we're going to go for 2 passes of wire around those 2 heavier wires. What we're going to do now is to bring the cut tail up between the number 1 and number 2 wire and very firmly pull that into position, returning the cut tail of wire upwards. I'm then going to slide that number 3 wire into position. These are all sat side by side, so if you put them on the desk they'd all be flat together. We will then wrap the number 2 and number 3 wires together twice, around twice. You can scooch that up every time you complete a 2 wrap, and then we'll add the number 4 wire in. We'll just hold that out of the way for a second. What we're going to do is bring the cut tail of wire around and up between the number 2 and number 3 wires, pulling it firmly against those 2 little wraps we just did. Push the tail of wire upwards. Then we will drop in that number 4 wire. You can keep these vaguely the same length for now. Again, we're about 2 inches from the end because we will be adding some weaving with this short tail of wire that we're working with right now. We're going to bring the tail of wire again around number 3 and number 4 and up between number 2 and number 3. Pull that all the way over, wrap and bring downwards. So you can see we have built an increasing upwards weave. So we've got 2 wraps around 1 and 2, 2 wraps around 2 and 3, 3 wraps around 3 and 4. We're then going to bring the tail of wire up between the number 1 and number 2 wires. So on the back, this weave will look different. Then we shall wrap around number 2 and number 3, and we'll do that twice. So draw the wire through, scooch it up neatly against the preceding wraps, push the tail of wire up between 1 and 2 again, wrap all the way around the number 2 and number 3 wires, scooch that tautly into position, and then we're going to finish off by wrapping twice around the number 1 and number 2 wires. So let's just get that down between number 2 and number 3, pull that firmly into position. You can give it a bit of a wiggle to encourage it, scooch it up against the preceding wrap. We'll then take that tail of wire around number 1 and number 2, so we have a second wrap around those 2 lower wires. Scooch that wire all the way up and pull it firmly down towards the bottom. Now at each end of this section of wrapping, we're going to need to do 2 single wraps just to secure everything neatly. If you cut a wire off at the back and it's going around 2 wires, usually, not always, but usually that gives you a risk of things coming undone. It's not the same in every single design. Scooch that wrap really, really neatly, and then I'm going to take the tail of wire so it wraps around only wire number 1, the lowest wire. So pull that neatly into position, scooch it over, take the tail again between number 1 and number 2 wires, push it firmly against the preceding wrap, and then we'll turn it over. Get that tail out of the way for a second and trim that as close as you possibly can to the back of that little section of weaving, and then make sure that you tuck that tail down and away. So I'm just pushing the tail around the number 1 wire, which is presently at the top of the screen. If it helps you to see it, you can just open that out slightly, push that tail of wire down and give it a very gentle squish to make sure it sits in position. Let's return this to the correct way up. And then we're just going to make sure that that little pyramid of weaving is nice and neat and tidy. Make sure you're happy with it. Once you're happy, pull this tail of wire out of the way so we don't compress it, and give that first little pyramid a gentle squish. Now, if one of your wires comes awry at this stage, you can push them along a little bit. You could tap that down on the desk if you prefer. So I have here around about 1.25 inches to 1.5 inches of residue at one end. What we're going to do now, we have learnt the weave, is turn it upside down. And then you remember we put that tail of wire that connected to the spool, that was very loosely around that number 1. So number 1 is now up at the top. You can reorder them if you want to, but what we need to do is bring that tail down and away. The only reason it was loosely wrapped around the wire I have my hand on right now is so that there was a gap between number 1 and number 2 wires. As we've inverted the design, I'm just going to open these out slightly and very, very softly just put a little bend on either end, and then a slightly smaller bend on the middle 2 wires. So you should be able to detect whereabouts your number 1, 2, 3 and 4 wires are. So we've currently got an upside down pyramid. Well, what we're going to do is to move all the way along the weave now to create a really lovely selection of zigzags. So I'm just going to show you the weave once, and then you will repeat it until you have just the same amount of bare wire left at the other end. And again, I began with 6-inch lengths of the heavier wire, but you would need a little bit more than that, maybe 8 inches if you're going for a slightly larger finger size. So we've got a tail of wire that's connected to our spool. I'm going to bring that up between number 3 and number 4. Now that might seem a little bit out of place so far, but what we're going to do now is wrap twice around 2 and 3. That's 1, That's 2, and draw it firmly down the back. And then we're going to go around number 3 and 4. Let's make sure that's brightly lit. Around number 3 and 4 twice, and then bring the tail of wire up between 3 and 4, just here, nice and firmly against those preceding 2 stripes, and then around 2 and 3, all the way around them twice, and then the tail of wire comes up between 2 and 3, and then we're wrapping around 1 and 2 again. So you're always wrapping around just 2 wires at a time. It's a nice W now, or if you flip it up the other way, I guess it could be an M. So continue all the way along until you have a similar amount of bare wire left at the far end. So I've got around about 1.5 inches of bare wire just at this end. So I've continued all the way along with my zigzaggy weave, and every time I've done that little wrap of 2 around 2 wires at a time, I've scooched that along with my nail. You could always use the outside edge of your bent chain nose pliers if that's easier for you, or if you have nice nails. I don't. And then I have got to the stage where there is an approximately equal amount of bare wire at either end. So I'm going to show you now how we move on to create your wide woven ring. So there's my woven section in the centre, and I just want to show you very quickly how different it looks on the rear of the design. So you can see I've banded 2 wires at a time, skipped down to the next 2, skipped down to the next 2, finishing with a wrap twice around the wire on either end. If I show you the rear side of the design, it's a slightly different weave. It's not unattractive. It's just I really like the symmetry of this one. So you might need to just take a moment if you've got any deviations in those wires. You might just want to give that a little bit of a manoeuvre just to make sure that they're straight. You can check that by pressing down onto your board, and you'll be able to see gaps underneath it if it's very wiggly. The next thing I'm going to do is to trim either end to be the same length. So I would start with the very shortest wire that you have available, and whilst you're weaving you might find that these wires wiggle around, and you'll need to just try and control it so that you still have that 1.75 inches or so of bare wire at the end. So what I'm going to do is to match the shortest wire on this end, and then I will measure this distance from the last woven section to the end, and then I will match that on the far side. Now if it's within a little bit, you've got some tolerances, it doesn't have to be exact, so in that essence, I'm just going to kind of eyeball it and hope for the best, but you can obviously measure that if you wish to. The reason I put my hand over the top of that wire is because it can ping up and hit your camera, and we don't want that. So there's my woven section. Time at right now, it's very much the time to check that you are going to use the side of the weave that you want. Now, if any of your weaving is a little bit loose, you can just softly tighten that up and give the whole thing a very gentle squish. I wouldn't recommend hammering it at this stage because you might make it slightly too brittle. So I have my very old trusty wooden mandrel that's been with me for about 14 years. And what I'm going to do is to put that weave that I like the look of on the outside, pop my mandrel into position and create a spiral of a ring form, just like so. So I am going to get those 2 ends of wire to cross over at the point where we had that wrap around just the 1 wire. But you can have a bare bit, or you can have it crossing over. It doesn't really matter. It's just basically an idea of how to measure. If you wanted to make a specific ring size and you wanted it to meet, then you could take that measurement of the particular ring size on a sized mandrel and then measure your weave as you go. I'm just eyeballing it and seeing what finger it fits on, to be perfectly honest. The next thing I'm going to do is to put some extra heat and warmth through these tail sections. It really does pay to warm this through. I wouldn't put a flame on it, but just give that a little bit of heat and warmth, and it will certainly help you on your way to making a nice smooth design. Now with this ring in particular, I opened up the spiral so that I have 2 facing to the left and 2 facing to the right on either side. and I think it looks a little bit like a vine leaf climbing upwards, but you can make those spirals go exactly where you want them to. What I haven't done is got them to cross over adequately, so at the moment you can see there's a bit of a V in the top there, and ideally what I want to do is to have that so that they are flat, and also so that there is a perfectly symmetrical crossover point. So I'm just going to push that down a little bit more and take another look. So if I turn that sideways, you can see we've now got the flat line, and that's just a symmetry thing for me. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to very gently, having warmed that wire, pull 2 of the wires away, the 2 upper ones. I'll just gently give them a little bit more coercion. Now, if you're concerned about deforming the ring, you can absolutely do this whilst it's on the mandrel. What we don't want to do is pull sharply away. So you can see, because I've warmed the wire, it really does want to please. It will kind of go where you want it to. So I'm just going to open those up a little bit and then do the same on the other side. Put a little bit more heat in that one. It feels like it's seen a little bit too much action. So once I've got those wires splayed a little bit, I'm going to take it off the mandrel because it's easier for me to show you what is happening. And I'm going to show you what to do on just the one side, and then you can choose whether to repeat the pattern on the second side of the ring or whether you want to go a slightly different way. Absolutely up to you. I'm going to begin using my memory wire finishing pliers, purely because I like the way that I can get a symmetrical centre on my coils. All of these ends are flush cut. Now you can see that what happens when you put the ring design onto a mandrel is that as you push it round, because the mandrel is shaped in an increasing or decreasing form, that those wires will move around slightly differently. Now you can, if you want to, just trim them so that they're all the same length again once you have made them move around the mandrel. You don't have to, because it's quite organic. It's quite like a little vine leaf. I'm going to show you now how to start off your spiral with a round form. You could use your memory wire finishing pliers, as I am, pair of round pliers, or you could go for your bail making, your multi-step bail makers. Well, let's just start that circular form off, give it a squish, and then start moving that into position. Now I'm supporting the centre of the ring, the shank of the ring, so that it doesn't get too bent out of shape. But again, you could rest this on your mandrel of choice and allow that to take any of that fear away. Now when you're making spirals that you then want to use in a free standing position, as they are here pretty much, you do want to just go nice and steady, and every time you're pressing on them you are actually adding a little bit of work hardening to it. So let's go for a second spiral. If you heard my wrist go click, sorry, it's terrible weather today. All the way around, all the way around, and then switch to your flat facing pliers to generate the remainder of that spiral. Now if you wanted to, you could add little gemstone beads into those spirals. To do that you would need to open the spirals up slightly, so it's really how much at risk you want to put those spirals. I would say this is very definitely a cocktail ring. It's not something that you will wear to the supermarket or grocery store and then carry several dozen bags home with you, because you will probably wreck it. So it's very much a dress ring. So for the other side, I've started the first 2 spirals. I'm just going to push the next 2 wires up a little bit further. And the reason I'm doing that is because I want to bring this spiral closer down. So each collection, I've got 2 going over to the left, and then I'll have 2 going over to the right. So let's start that next spiral. Pop the plier into position, rotate until you get that first circular form. And then we will grab that circular form and rotate it around and around. Now with this one, I'm going to bring it right down to the nexus of the ring. You have the opportunity of pushing that slightly closer together. And again, that's something that you might benefit from being done on the mandrel. What I would say is, if you're popping this on a mandrel to use it, make sure that you flip it around occasionally, and that will make the ring a little bit more symmetrical. Otherwise you end up with a slightly cone shape on your design because it's a wide band ring. So let's continue with that spiral until it sits down against the main band of that ring. You might need to flip your pliers around in a different direction You could even have your spiral going up and away. It's entirely up to you how you sit these designs. What I think I might do is open this one back out and push it over the top a little bit. That will give me a little bit more space to get this next spiral down close to the lowest spiral. So again, grip that end, bring it all the way round, stop before you finish a complete circle. It'll give you a slightly better chance of having a rounded centre to your spirals. The main thing is don't rush like I am right now, just go nice and slowly and your spirals will always be more delightful. So I think I will just sit and play with that for a minute, push that spiral up and over a little bit, take this one further round. Maybe just lift this one up a little bit so I can elevate the lowest of my spirals on this side. Now again, this can be as organic as you want it to be. You can have all the spirals going in the same direction if you want to, but I'm going to repeat quite a similar design on the second side. So I've taken a second to complete the second half of the ring in a similar but organically different design, and I'm going to show you now how you can finish that off and make it fit really comfortably on the finger. So as you can see from the side view, everything is very flat, and the ring I'm wearing right now is nice and curved. I'll show you that on the overhead fashion. So that fits really comfortably on the finger. And it's less likely to catch on things, but as I say, it is a bit of a dress ring. So why don't we put this on my stunt mandrel, and you can see how that sits up and away from the roundness. Now, one of the ways that you can achieve that lovely curve is to grab a pair of pliers and just take a hold of each of those spirals, take half of the spiral in the jaw of the pliers, push down with your thumb on your non-dominant hand, and you will get this delicate curve starting to work. So let's do that on this one side of the ring. If you struggle to do that, let's grab a second pair of chain nose pliers to hold the first side of each of those spirals. And I'm doing this in one because they are in tandem with each other, getting my second chain nose pliers to be just to the left of centre of both of those spirals, gripping the other half of the spirals and twisting down. So even if you struggle to do that by hand, you can still do that with tools. Now let's flip this around into the old... How am I going to do this? Let's have a look. I think I'll be able to get that in like so, and then grip with the rounded side over here, and then just push that last one down. The way that I actually prefer to achieve this bend in the ring is actually to be very cruel to my trusty old ring mandrel. So I'm going to pop that into position on the mandrel. I'm going to grab my nylon head hammer. It's not terribly heavy, but it is good for repeated thwacking onto a wooden mandrel. And I'm just going to support the centre of those spirals whilst I hammer on the extremities. So let's do that on the second side. Now it's ideal if you don't strike terribly much on the woven section. A little tap probably won't do too much damage, but ideally let's not hit that at all. So I'm going to support, as you can see, let me show you actually how much they're sticking up. So there's a lot of air just underneath there. So again, we're going to support the spiral that's connected to the rest of the wire ring. And then we'll strike down to get that much, much closer. Another way you can do this is just go whack happy. But if you support the side that's connected to the weaving, you will end up with a much better result because it will tap down neatly. So I'm going to do the same on the far side. So I'm supporting where the wire is connected to the weaving, and I'm going to thwack down on the open side of the spiral. So as I mentioned earlier, you will probably want, if you're using a tapered mandrel like I am, just to twist that around in the opposite direction so that you can ensure all of the spirals sit down neatly. And in that way, you end up with this lovely curved, very comfortable to wear design. Let's see what finger that fits on. Oh, it's quite a big one, this one. So they both fit really, really nicely. They are adjustable to a degree, so you can just gently squish that up. That was quite a little bit too large for me, so just close that up slightly and then it will fit definitely a little bit better. They are definitely not an everyday ring, but they are very inexpensive to make. It's also a fantastic way of using up your practice weaves. Thanks for hanging out with me today whilst we made the wide woven rings with that lovely organic swirliness. Like I said earlier, it kind of reminds me of tendrils of vines growing in a way. I don't know what you think, let me know in the comments down below. One thing I would like to ask you to do, if you'd care to join me on my Facebook group, which is Gem Hawkes Jewellery Chat. You don't have to chat about jewellery, on Tuesday we chat about pets. Then you can share anything that you make from my tutorials on this channel. I would love to see your makes. I'd also love to feature a number of you in a guest's video. So if you fancy having your makes shared on the YouTube channel, get in touch on Gem Hawkes Jewellery Chat, a group on Facebook, and let me see what you've been making with me. If you have any requests, drop me a comment. Don't forget to leave a like and a subscription if you're enjoying the content. Have yourself a fantastic day and I'll see you very soon. Bye for now.